Chuck Baird is a master of integration in art, full of kaleidoscopic and colorful ideas. He learned and developed many skills and techniques, blending them together into a new art form. He excels in multiple fields, much like a multi-talented Renaissance man. He is versatile, adaptable, and a realistic artist. He is extremely creative and experimental. He is considered to be one of the most important artists in America. This is a story about an artist documenting and expressing his journey in an era of social change. Chuck experienced social upheaval and cultural shifts in the deaf world, which is comprised of the signing deaf community. However, this is not a story about a single artist's journey of self-identity. Instead, it is about the way society views deaf people, their culture, and how such an art movement was established. This is a story that brings you the raw experience of deaf people expressed through our artists. It is such an exciting moment to witness the metamorphosis. When you do, it could challenge you to rethink your ideas, beliefs, and understandings about the identity, culture, and language of deaf people. Chuck's artwork displays his talent, skill, and intelligence, and it raises awareness about his world. Society's lack of understanding about the differences has made him and other deaf artists seek refuge to establish their own niche. Hence, Chuck's artwork becomes a statement that deaf and hearing worlds need to converge. That is, by coming together they become one, with no beginning and no end. He has exceptional skills in acrylic and oil painting. He has produced many rich and dynamic pieces in these media. His craftsmanship is phenomenally precise. Much of his artwork includes deaf themes, symbols, and images, including sign language, with emphasis on hand shapes that live and breathe in the deaf world. Chuck's artwork is frequently shown in the deaf community, but you can often find his work in more conventional exhibits. Chuck creates tangible and real artwork using carefully controlled painting techniques. He combines observation and imagination. His work is strongly influenced by the modern and pop art movements. In this realm, his interests in subject matter focus on landscape, still life, and people. His body of work is whimsical, stimulating, and cheerful. Meanwhile, in the deaf community, there was an upheaval, a cry for change, leading to a movement known as Devia. Hence, a new art movement was created by a camaraderie of deaf artists sharing different and personal and political experiences. Chuck was one of the few who was willing to sign the Devia Manifesto. Even though he knew that deaf world themes were important, he also knew they were not equally important to his patrons. So, in order to make a decent living, he abandoned the idea of deaf-related themes and turned his attention to more widely acceptable art. He is a very detailed artist who is both a traditionalist and an experimentalist. He records what he sees. He has been able to straddle both worlds successfully. Chuck created an allegory in his painting showing the juxtaposition between the cultures of two worlds. In left and right, he creates mental connections using flowers, hands, and planets, and he places an oath chair in close proximity to his most vital organs. The pair of hands, black and white on the left and color on the right, represent two hearts, two minds, and two worlds. In the background, beyond the horizon, we see a gradient blue sky. In the foreground, a golden flat meadow. We also see the sun setting and the moon rising on either side of the central subject. The dark and medium blue clouds scatter in the middle and bleed out to the edges. Chuck testifies, remembering the moment the image was born, driving down a highway, seeing the sun on one side and the moon on the other. He felt as though language and culture had slipped into equilibrium. The calla lilies sit in a tall vase on top of the oath chair to symbolize love, growth, rebirth, and resurrection. The natural lilies overlap, representing his cross-cultural experiences. He is fully alive as he sits on the brain and shows both hope and hopelessness, feeling a gravitational pull between two planets, two worlds. The overall image conveys a stable, intellectual inner self.
In my painting titled Left and Right, the vase sits on a chair where you see the two calla lily stems are overlapping. They represent a cross-cultural experience. Harry Williams had a penchant for using calla lilies as a subject.
Chuck Baird was born in Kansas City, Missouri. His father worked as a mechanic repairing machines and electronic equipment. His mother worked as a nurse for the American Red Cross. Chuck had 4 siblings. He and his 3 sisters were born deaf and attended the Kansas School for the Deaf in Olathe. His hearing brother was an abstract photographer. Chuck's mother saw his potential as an artist early in his life. He began his art education when he was in junior high school. He graduated from KSD in 1967. Chuck enrolled at Gallaudet University and later transferred to the Rochester Institute of Technology's School of Art and Design. Chuck participated in a class painting project as an experiment. He graduated in 1974 with a bachelor's degree in studio painting. Soon after, Chuck Baird began his career as an art teacher. He later served as an artist in residence in multiple organizations and schools.
I will always have a special place in my heart for my hometown, Kansas City. The place where I grew up was culturally and artistically rich. I think I had a good deal of exposure to art and culture since I was a young boy.
Kansas City is known for its literary and visual arts and bohemian culture. These paintings were created during his journey as an artist in the mid-1980s, when Chuck envisioned his world in his mind and then replicated it on canvas. He captured color, light, and form using ordinary objects. His painting style has many aspects of realism. His images look so real, almost photographic. He would take a photograph of the subject and transform its images on canvas. Chuck actually cannot live without a camera. Although as a young artist he was confident in his work, he wasn't clear where he belonged. He wondered if his work belonged to the mainstream art world or to the deaf art world. An art critic once compared him to Georgia O'Keeffe and David Hockney. He studied the works of Ralph Goings and Marcel Duchamp. The influence of these artists can clearly be seen in Chuck's highly stylized forms. He likes to make his paintings and images larger than life, to see what kind of a reaction he could elicit from his viewers. His paintings always appear magical. Chuck also was greatly influenced by another artist, the late Harry Williams, who was a highly regarded, courageous deaf artist, willing to share his views through his artwork. Harry and Chuck shared a sense of the aesthetic and the beauty of culture in their silent world. ASL has always been their mode of communication since they attended deaf schools and have deaf siblings. Artwork created by Harry Williams brought out his own perceptions of deaf culture. This gave Chuck an opportunity to reflect on the beauty of the private lives of deaf people. Without a doubt, They both have been extremely influential artists.
Harry Williams was very focused and clever. He had a significant influence on my work. He was able to capture the deaf experience in a positive light. Harry often used violins as subject matter. He was quite taken with their Baroque-inspired shapes and beautiful curvilinear lines. Baroque art is defined by ornate and intense curves. Even the neck of the violin is heavily scrolled at the top. Much like a curly lock of hair or the spiral of a pig's tail. Classic.
Chuck joined the National Theater of the Deaf. During his 11-year tenure from 1980 to 1991, he became an actor and a stage set designer. He is best remembered for his work in King of Hearts, a play based on Felipe de Broca's cult film classic.
I had a great experience with the National Theater of the Deaf in a production called The King of Hearts. My role was the painter. I was the last person to come out for curtain call, and the audience gave me a standing ovation. They went wild.
Chuck performed as a painter on stage, recreating the entire canvas each night in front of live audiences.
I painted the entire set, from beginning to end.
One reviewer asked, "Is Baird a painter who acts or an actor who paints?" Joe Danis, a deaf founder and CEO of Dawn Sign Press, asked Chuck to incorporate ASL images in his work. At first, Chuck was reluctant, but he put his artistic skills to the task. Even though this commissioned work was not of his style, he began to use aspects of ASL hand shapes and examine the issues of language and culture in his new work. He brought familiar approaches to the new art form. This turned out to be a worthwhile endeavor as he produced over 60 paintings. His ASL-themed paintings exploded with depth and color. Here's an example of one of the earlier works in the series. The hand shape that is used for the sign cat is beautifully formed. Light, shadow, and skin colors are emphasized. Here, he integrates the ASL hand shapes for cat and 9 into one image, playing on the double meaning, a cat has 9 lives. Chuck was no longer an isolated artist, but a mainstream artist.
When I worked for Dawn Sign Press, I was encouraged to create art that was related to the deaf experience or sign or ASL. So I experimented with this new idea, and all of a sudden I'd created my first piece. I was working with the image of a cat titled Double 9 Lives because the hand shapes convey a double meaning. They mean both cat and the number 9. The late 60s and early 70s, that era was a complete and dramatic turning point for us. It changed the course of deaf history, really.
To emphasize just how transformative those times were, remember America was going through several revolutionary experiences. Protests against the Vietnam War, along with the booming awareness of cultural differences. At the same time, the deaf community emerges and takes its place in the mainstream society. Part of this movement was inspired by a study that found that ASL was a legitimate language with its own linguistic rules. The reaction in the deaf community was mixed. There were those who celebrated the findings, and there were those who criticized them, because it was conducted by a hearing man, Professor William Stokey at Gallaudet University. He pioneered the study of sign language and published the first dictionary of American Sign Language in 1965. Deaf people use a natural visual language called American Sign Language. Educators and social scientists were surprised by Stokey's new discovery, which generated much interest and curiosity about American Sign Language, or ASL. For almost a century, the schools discouraged and repressed ASL except in residential schools, where ASL has been a primary mode of communication from generation to generation. As deaf students learn and grow using their natural language, they become more empowered.
Total communication was a mass of confusion and inadequate communication. We were victims of it. The whole thing was just bizarre.
Finally, ASL was getting the recognition it was due.
Betty Miller's well-known art show was like the shot that was heard and seen around the world. Her new work was all about the deaf experience. Through his research, William Stokey found that ASL was a language in its own right. We as deaf people finally felt a sense of dignity and respect. We were no longer labeled as oral failures. Historically, we could communicate fluently in ASL, but when asked if we could talk or speak, and our answer was no, we were considered oral failures. We accepted and internalized the idea that we were failures until the 70s came around. That was a time when it was okay to be deaf. It was okay to be a woman or black. It was all about the individual and self-identity.
ASL is a living language, creating and reflecting deaf culture. Chuck joined a nonprofit organization called Spectrum, Focus on Deaf Artists, based in Austin, Texas in 1977, where he also served as a member of the board of directors. They were planning to develop a program designed to establish a colony of deaf artists on a 10-acre ranch. One of the founders and executive director, Jeanette Norman, and the other program directors, Betty Miller and Clarence Russell, began their work to promote and support deaf art and the deaf performing arts. They received grants from Exxon and the National Endowment for the Arts. This was an equal access opportunity to explore the needs of deaf artists and to include their social and cultural perceptions of the deaf world. This was a point when people began to realize that the two worlds, deaf art and mainstream art, and their artists could not be autonomous. Instead, they knew they must work together.
In 1970, Betty Miller held her one-woman show. Then in 1975, a few of us deaf artists got together during the World Federation of the Deaf Conference in Washington, D.C. Harry Williams brought a few people from California. I came from Rochester. It was just a small group of us, maybe 4 or 5.
I met a woman from Texas who wanted to set up an organization for deaf artists, and it seemed like an interesting idea.
Jeanette Norman asked us what our dreams were. We said we wanted a colony for deaf artists. Jeanette brought that idea back to Texas and found the funds. Soon after, Jeanette was telling us to come to Texas. Everything came together. We had the place, the time, and before you knew it, we were moving to Texas.
It was called Spectrum, Focus on Deaf Artists.
In the time between 1977 and 1980, Betty kept encouraging us to express our deaf experience and identity in our art. As a collective, we thought it over, but the truth is, we were not ready. We felt that it was not appropriate to use art for that purpose. Betty continued to say it is within us. Despite her repeated attempts, she could not get through to us.
Let me tell you a little bit about the Spectrum Ranch. We had 10 acres. The building you see here was for activities. We had a platform built for dancing and exercise. Then there was the ranch house, just around the bend, that I had bought along with another gentleman. It was so nice.
Betty was a very patient and encouraging leader.
I adapted this from a photograph. You will notice the masks. They represent the struggles many of us faced as we were growing up in the oral schools for the deaf, where many of us were taught and forced to lip read and talk. Some of the people have gold stars on their forehead, and that is something I took from my childhood also. When we spoke well in school, we were rewarded with gold stars on our foreheads. Not everyone got the stars. The children who were completely deaf and had no speech abilities did not get any.
At the time, Betty stood alone. The rest of us deaf artists were not quite ready. Betty was, and she was ready to reveal to the world what the deaf experience was all about. You know, it's actually funny. People call Betty the mother of deaf art. You know who gave her that title? I did. I thought it was only fitting that if Paul Cézanne is the father of modern art, that Betty be the mother of deaf art. Eventually, Spectrum ran out of money and folded in 1980. Later, around 1989,
Chuck describes his utopian deaf experience with his vivid imagination. This massive mural shows tremendous muscular forms with an array of brilliant and diverse skin colors, which are really fauve and rich. This is a mythical story of a futuristic society that unites many shades of colors regardless of gender, race, age, and culture to form a sense of unity and harmony. A pair of glowing hands in the upper left-hand side shows a sense of enlightenment and beauty for global peace.
as different as we are, none of that matters.
The whole image is about crossing cultural boundaries. An orange adult signs, "Me, deaf like you," which is grammatically correct in ASL, while a light beige young child asks, "You deaf?" The varying shapes of hands are highlighted throughout, which symbolizes touch, comfort, and love. The figures synthesize a sense of peaceful, communicative affinity. They are liberated, that is, free to communicate without any barriers. The Deaf Way celebration arrived at Gallaudet University in 1989. The visionary artists Betty Miller and Paul Johnston moderated the discussion for the group. Their backgrounds were extremely diversified. Betty and Paul invited an art historian and many artists to discuss questions such as, what is deaf art? What are the expressions and aesthetics of the deaf world? The signatories convened in a 4-day workshop. They were Deborah Sonnenstrahl, Alex Wilhite, Nancy Creighton, Sandy Vasnick, Guy Wonder, and Lai Yok Ho. Chuck rejoined the group that had achieved a sense of social liberation and empowerment from their experiences at Spectrum. They discussed the critical aspects of art and deaf culture. The Devia Manifesto addressed concerns about artistic styles, subject matter, and symbolism, which established the artistic goals to be included in the Devia mission.
What is a manifesto? For this particular group of deaf artists, it meant coming together to create the document that became the declaration of foundational concepts of a new art form. That produced the Devia Manifesto.
Betty and Paul Johnston were there. They, along with others, put the plans into action.
The seminal ideas of Devia can be traced back to Betty during the days of Spectrum in Texas. Devia also has its roots in a workshop that was held at Gallaudet University just before Deaf Way. And in this workshop, participants were asked to respond to the essential question: do we have deaf art?
We had roundtable discussions for 4 full days.
Betty invited artists to attend a workshop, so they were physically together. And in this way, Betty was a lot more visible. And more people got to know and see who she was.
It was really interesting. It was a round table discussion. Well, without an actual round table. We all sat around in a circle and talked about what we thought being a deaf artist meant and what deaf art was. We did this for a good part of the day, then we did an experiment. Each of us drew our ideas. We showed them to each other and then did some visualization exercises. It was like a theater lab. We also did sensory memory exercises where we drew the first thing that came to our minds.
Betty was the driving force. She raised consciousness. She got the idea of deaf art out there.
Disappointed, she asked us what was wrong with the term deaf art.
We debated. Give it a new name or keep it as deaf art.
Yeah, but we needed to find a name that's more catchy.
And some argued if we called it deaf art, then no one would pay attention. It wouldn't be anything new.
The other thing that we did was create a collective mural. Each of us painted a part of it. It was an amazing piece. We all signed it at the bottom.
We called it a visual manifesto, accompanied by a written manifesto.
We all got together in an old computer lab and sat down at our individual stations, working on drafting different parts of this manifesto. But we were all collaboratively working the whole time by sending parts of it to each other. It became a living document that we were working on in the lab, and in the end, it turned into our written manifesto.
Then this novel term appeared on the scene, devia. People were really curious. They wanted to know what this new term was all about. They thought it was rather strange. That's what we wanted.
Myself and Paul Johnston went to a workshop. And it was there that we announced our manifesto of deaf view image art. The Europeans, they were just thrilled to death. And the movement grew from there.
I was told the painting was stolen. It's a mystery.
Devia is an acronym for Deaf View Image Art, which was established to raise awareness through the creation of visual art and visual literacy. This artistic expression would validate the deaf world and deaf culture. It is the art that crosses cultural borders made by artists that express their desire to be identified as devia artists. The expressions within their experiences would vary between disciplines and mediums. The devia movement helped showcase the wide range of experiences since it began in 1989. When artists were attuned primarily to the oral mode of communication, such experiences did not include the deaf experiences in visual art. Devia artists and emerging artists had their coming out stories. The movement gained momentum, which was not widely received.
There was a lot of debate. Anne Silver did not endorse the term devia. Yes, you're right. She wanted it to be known as deaf art. And I think, perhaps from my view, she didn't think we needed to reinvent the wheel.
Tom Willard, former member of Deaf Artists of America, asks,
"What is devia anyway? What's wrong with calling deaf art deaf art? It sounds like a French word for nitwit or nut."
Chuck provides an analogy to a familiar art movement.
We drew our inspiration from a small group of artists that often met in Paris salons at the turn of the 20th century. They discussed what their paintings had in common, while critics chided them, asking, "Who are you trying to impress?" Over time, this movement became known as French Impressionism. The term was foreign to the public at first, but now is one of the world's most beloved artistic movements. We, the creators of devia, took our cue from the early Impressionists and remained silent while the critics railed against us. We knew that with time these arguments would fade into the background.
At the workshop, I explained to them that this is exactly the same thing that happened to Manet. Lunch on the Grass shows two fully clothed men and two naked women just having a picnic lunch on the grass in France. So why did the artist do that? He had noticed that people had stopped talking about art. They were taking art for granted. So he decided to paint two fully clothed men and two naked women to draw attention to the art world. And of course people looked and asked, why are those two naked women there? That became the talk.
Professor Patty Durr at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf mentions that disenfranchised groups often produce art that is unique to their own experiences. Art is often produced in a similar manner amongst minority groups such as African American art, Native American art, Chicano art, women's art, and gay art. The traits are striking enough to distinguish them from others within the same society. These distinctions preserve their culture and values, represent experiences, and communicate ideas to make social and political statements.
How I identify myself has come full circle. When I was young, I was simply an artist. That's all I wanted to be. Then, when people started talking about this idea of a deaf artist, I wondered if that applied to me. Deaf is an adjective, artist is a noun, and both describe me, so it worked for me for a little while. Next was artist who happens to be deaf. That didn't work. So I went back to deaf artist. Later, Devia artist. Now, going back to my roots, I simply call myself an artist. The thing that fascinates me about being an artist, the most essential and exciting part about being an artist, is spirit. Art is spirit. For me, as a visual artist, I painted canvases to make money. I challenged myself by looking for new and different ideas that might appeal to both deaf and hearing people and inspire them to buy my work. Their support motivated me to create more works appealing to the public and allowed me to make a living from my artwork.
Chuck believes being a commercial artist is one way to earn a living. However, he also wants to be certain that his images appear unique and attractive for patrons. So, he integrated ASL elements with popular culture and consumer products to create a new art form. The hand shape appears frozen, but at the same time, it seems to be moving on the canvas. Chuck creates cultural assimilation. He is credited as one of the few early American Devia artists.
I chose a black friend from college as a model for my giraffe painting. My image represents diversity.
Chuck also incorporated literature and imagery that features culturally sensitive art. For instance, Chuck portrayed individual images depicting experiences of Navajo culture and women's history. Chuck immerses himself with brilliant and experimental ideas, which make his artwork appear unique and captivating.
I have seen his identity as an artist evolve over time. He started out as an artist. Later, he became immersed with Devia. Then he went back to being an artist without focusing on the deaf experience. He has good reason, and I completely understand. Deaf artists have to eat sometimes. They have to have bread on the table. So artists have to be in tune with what people want. And when hearing people see Devia artwork, they don't buy it because they don't appreciate the representation of the deaf experience. Most have no contact with the deaf community. So he had to go back to being an artist. But he has talent in that area also. He is very versatile, and he can easily create both types of art.
Chuck Baird is a rare breed, one of a kind and magical. It was Chuck's own decision to be an artist. Even though Chuck had his own inner struggles as a deaf man, his artwork had already generated thought-provoking controversy and crossed cultural boundaries. Regardless of the fact that he faithfully joined the Devia group and signed the manifesto, Chuck was never perceived as a Devia artist until he completed his paintings for Dawn Sign Press in 1992. Later on, Chuck developed a mural based on a history of American Sign Language. It was commissioned through a private school near Boston, the Learning Center for the Deaf, in 1994. At the same time, he researched, studied, and discovered his emerging identity as a deaf man. In addition to being a bohemian artist during the past 4 decades, he has become a true Devia artist. In the early 1970s, he created a large-scale painting of an ear with mechanical wires and devices. This was Chuck's first and earliest piece of work based on the deaf experience. The attached devices give us insight to his thoughts. He calls this work technology junks.
Chuck Baird collected books, writings, pictures, documents, and the like showing the history of ASL. Through his expressive art, he portrays this history in a mural.
Chuck Baird's mural is divided into 3 parts.
First, the Golden Ages.
Second, the Dark Ages.
Third, the American Sign Language Revival.
It was back in 1994 when the Learning Center in Boston contacted me to construct a 4-walled mural for them. When I asked the school director what the theme of this mural would be, he smiled and said, ASL, which surprised me because he was hearing. I spent the summer doing research, reading various publications on deaf history and ASL, so I'd be ready to start painting when the school year started in the fall. What I realized as I was reading was that these stories were stories about me. This history was my history. I discovered my identity. I was reborn, and I knew in my heart that this was my true identity. When you look at deaf history, it becomes clear that what makes us unique is our language, American Sign Language. With that in mind, I decided to paint the history of ASL, starting as far back as the sign systems used by the Native Americans, to the influences of the early days of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts and Laurent Clerc from France. All of those influences came together and formed the beginning of ASL. This is what I call the tree house, and you can see it's not actually a house, but a series of platforms connected by stairs, and on the highest platform sits a grand piano. The piece is really whimsical in nature. It's easy to imagine children playing on those lower levels. But the topmost level is reserved for the formality and grandeur of the piano, classical music, and adulthood. So the two concepts are connected by this pathway up, and who knows? Someday these children may become concert pianists. There's humor here because as you look at this tree, it becomes quite obvious how absurd it is that you would have a 1 or 2 ton piano on the uppermost level, Clearly, it couldn't withstand the weight, would topple over. So I took this piece to a few galleries in the hopes that they would buy some of my work. Typically, artists start out with the smaller galleries, co-ops, and so forth, working their way up the artist echelon, building their reputation, and eventually approaching the larger, more prestigious galleries. But I decided I would just start there, at the top. The owner liked what I showed her and excitedly asked if I had any more, and I replied, "Indeed I do," in my car. A month later, there was an elegant wine and cheese reception. As the crowd milled around and looked at the artwork, I sat in the corner, sipping some wine, as if I was simply one of the patrons. A number of people walked by and looked at the treehouse. A mother and child stopped to look more closely and were very taken with the piece. The mother looked down at the sculpture while her daughter looked up. I was struck by the fact that I made this piece for this moment, for an adult and a child to share. What was so beautiful was that as they looked at it, they moved closer to one another and embraced. I can't tell you how much that meant to me. Later, the owner of the gallery introduced me to the mother and daughter as the artist who had created the treehouse. But I didn't have an interpreter with me, so I couldn't really engage as much as I wanted to. What I saw in that gallery that night was an affirmation for me. I was an artist. I was content.